Some teachers insist on teaching the names of the strokes that make up Chinese characters. But is learning the stroke names worthwhile or just a waste of time? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about Chinese characters, and more specifically, we're going to talk about the strokes that make up the characters. But before I answer the question posed in the introduction, I'd like to say that there is a vocabulary challenge starting on December 10th. And as usual, if you listen to this after the challenge is over, you can still go to challenges.hackingchinese.com to see what challenges are available. These challenges are meant to help you improve your Chinese through daily practice and friendly competition, so you set a goal for the month and you try to study as much as you can. And this time, the focus is on characters and vocabulary. So I'd like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about a question that actually popped up in episode 3 of the podcast, How to Not Teach Chinese Characters to Beginners, a 12-Step Approach. So the things I talked about in that episode are of course things that you shouldn't do, and number one is about the stroke names, and I basically say that teaching them, or indeed learning them then, is not very helpful. So the answer to the question if you should learn the names of the strokes in Chinese characters is no. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese pod... no, of course I will say a little bit more about this than just no. But the truth is that many had opinions about the names of the strokes and if they are useful or not. And after reading through this and debating with people and reading up a little bit and thinking about it, I really haven't changed my mind. I still think that learning the names of the strokes as a beginner is largely a waste of time. But there is more to it than that, and that is what I want to talk about in this episode. So first of all, for those of you who are new to Chinese, characters are made up of strokes, or you use strokes to write them. And they have names in Chinese, and depending on how you name them, there could be just a few of them, maybe 8. But there are more complicated ways of doing it, and there are also combinations of strokes, so you can have more than 8 if you want to. So what happens in a traditional classroom is that the teacher will use these names and say them aloud while they write characters or when they instruct students how to write characters properly. In the context of teaching Chinese as a foreign language, I think it's exceedingly rare for foreigners to do this when they teach, but it is fairly common for native speakers to do so, and I have had many teachers who do this, and I think it is more common than not to do it. So why is it that I think that this is largely unnecessary in most cases? Isn't it nice to be able to use a name and to call a certain part of a character something, or to call a certain stroke something so you can explain how it works, or you can ask questions and discuss characters in a meaningful way? Well, yes, that is useful, but it is not the question that teachers or students should ask. It is not about would this be useful to know, but is this more useful to know than something else I could have learned instead? That is the real question. There are thousands and thousands of useful things to know, and you simply can't learn everything at once, which means that there has to be some kind of priority list here. And if you think that everything is equally important, well, then that's clearly wrong. There are some things that are very useful for beginners, and some things just aren't. And knowing the names of the strokes in Chinese isn't very useful. It's much less useful than knowing more common verbs, for example, or being better at pronunciation, or getting more exposure to reading, or something else. There are so many things you can do as a beginner, or if you're a teacher that you can do in your beginner classroom, that spending time on teaching the names of the strokes simply doesn't end up very close to the top of the list. In fact, I would say it ends up pretty close to the bottom. But one way it could be acceptable is if it's done by absorption in an immersion setting. So, for example, if the teacher is going through characters and constantly using these 8 words in Chinese over and over and over, while having some visual feedback because you see what the teacher is writing all the time, then I think that might be acceptable. You will probably learn these 8 different strokes fairly quickly, not by actually studying them explicitly or anything, but just by hearing the teacher saying them enough and seeing the characters that the teacher writes as they say these words. There are a couple of problems with this approach though, and the first is that it really requires quite a lot of immersion. If you have a teacher for an hour a week or 2 hours a week or something like that, you are never going to get enough exposure to be able to learn these things effortlessly simply by listening. There is also a risk that while you are learning them, that you misunderstand something, and if you're not explicitly taught what they mean, there are also many things that these names could refer to. Is it the length of the stroke? Is it maybe the slope of the stroke? Is it the direction it's written in? And so on. When you're new to characters, there are a lot of things, and if you're not taught about these things explicitly, it kind of doesn't really make sense to use the words, because then the learner will not really understand what the words mean, and then using them doesn't help much. The second problem is much more serious though. I simply don't think that writing characters together with the whole class every lesson is worthwhile. And this is unrelated to whether or not you call out the names of the strokes or however you do it. I simply don't think that writing characters by hand should be something that you do in class. It makes sense for the teacher to go through these things a little bit in the beginning if handwriting is part of the curriculum, but the majority of handwriting practice needs to take place outside of the classroom. If you really want to focus on handwriting, it is very easy to do so today compared with historically, because we have digital dictionaries where we can look up things like stroke order and we can have characters animated for us. And there is simply no need to know what the strokes are called. Another reason I think it's not worthwhile to focus too much on the strokes or the names of the strokes is that strokes don't mean anything. They are just graphical parts of a character. The same is true in the Latin alphabet, so if we learn to write, say, lowercase I, we don't need to know what the different parts are called. So did you, for example, know that the dot on top of the I is called a tittle? My bet is that most of you didn't, and it doesn't really matter. Now, it could matter in certain situations, of course, such as if you work with typography or if you're a calligrapher and you want to talk about that dot, how it's written, how it's spaced, how it's shaped, and so on and so forth. It is, of course, useful to have a name for it, and this is how professional jargon and terminology evolves. This is, of course, true for Chinese characters as well, so if you're a calligrapher or if you want to learn calligraphy, being able to discuss the strokes and variants of the strokes is, of course, very useful, and to be able to do that, you need the names. But that's not the point here. We are talking about beginners learning characters. We are not talking about typography, we're not talking about calligraphy. And if those are the things that you are interested in, then yes, of course, you should learn the names. But for the average beginner, learning the stroke names really is a waste of time. This can be tied to a bigger discussion about declarative versus procedural knowledge and explicit teaching. So declarative knowledge is things that you can describe. So for example, if you can tell me, using the stroke names perhaps, how to write a character, that is declarative knowledge. You're able to describe the process and how it works and what it looks like. Procedural knowledge, on the other hand, means being able to do something or use something. So for example, if you are able to write the character itself, that's procedural knowledge. And we all know that these are not terribly closely linked. Someone who can ride a bike doesn't know how to explain how riding a bike works. And similarly, a professional calligrapher cannot just tell you how to write a character that looks as nice as the character they just wrote. And for beginners, this simply means that being able to describe a character doesn't mean you can write it. So you're much better off actually writing characters if you want to learn how to write characters, rather than learning how to name the strokes. I said earlier that this is a matter of priority, so it's not the case that knowing the names has zero utility even for a beginner, it's just that many other things are more important to learn first. And of course, when you have studied Chinese for a while, you will learn the names of the strokes anyway, because these are part of the language. Almost all the stroke names are fairly common characters that are used in other situations, and you will learn them even if you don't try. So most people who have reached an advanced level will know the stroke names even though they've never tried to learn them. And this is really how it should be done, I think. If you really have to learn or teach the names of the strokes, I would say stick to the bare minimum. Teach those 7 or 8 words that are the most commonly used and ignore everything else. I've seen teachers who have 30 or 40 stroke names and combinations of strokes that they require students to learn, and this is complete madness because most native speakers don't actually know or use those names. So stick to the very basics if you have to use the stroke order names, but in most cases, just ignoring the stroke names works just fine. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.